In this section of the book, we're going to look at what it takes to maintain and to repair a vehicle when you are the owner of that vehicle. So with repairs and maintenance, every vehicle has their own schedule. And if you want to know when you need to perform oil changes or when you should flush fluids, realistically, you should be reading that owner's manual and you should be following the schedule that they've given you. Older cars typically have you do fluid flushes and change your oil much more frequently than newer cars, but in general, no matter what, you should read your owner's manual to determine when these items need to be addressed. In addition, it's always cheaper if you are able to actually do these repairs yourself. So if you know how to do an oil change on your car, you can save money by doing your own oil change. Or if you know how to replace the brakes, it's much cheaper for you to replace the brakes than to pay someone else to replace the brakes. However, it's always cheaper to have your car maintained routinely than to have to replace parts that break because you did not routinely maintain your car. A great example of this is getting an oil change. If you don't know how to change your oil and you don't want to pay someone else to change the oil, and that means you never change the oil, well, eventually your engine's going to lock up and it's going to break and you're going to need a new engine. So hiring a mechanic and having them change the oil versus hiring a mechanic to replace your engine is a much different price. It's cheaper to get the oil change than it is to replace the engine. Now, I did include some items that are things that you would have to attend to if you own a vehicle and there's routine maintenance you need to do. So things like oil changes. You would want to do those every 3,000 to 6,000 miles. Again, check your owner's manual. A lot of newer cars, it's every 6,000 miles, but some older cars, it's still 3,000 miles. You want to replace your windshield wipers regularly. If there's a torrential downpour on the highway and you're driving home, you're not going to be able to see if your windshield wipers aren't working. And so it's recommended that you replace them twice a year. Do it once in the spring, once in the fall. In addition, brakes don't last forever. These are things that you're going to replace somewhat frequently. Brakes, depending on the brakes you get, they're going to have an estimated life of 15,000 to 25,000 miles. And again, you would want to check and see the brakes you bought to see how long those brakes are actually going to last. The next box is things that you're going to do every couple years. So one of them is a radiator flush. You're going to want to flush your radiator out every 30,000 miles or so. With your transmission, you want to check the fluid at around 30,000 miles, and you want to keep checking it to make sure it's in good condition. Once it gets kind of yucky looking, you want to flush it and change that fluid. But once you get to 50,000 miles, no matter what, you probably just want to change it anyways. If you don't change your fluid and it gets nasty, you can ruin your transmission, and those are thousands of dollars to replace. The last item is your brake fluid. So even though you have brakes and you need to replace those, you also need to check the fluid in your brakes. And so it's recommended you check it every time you get an oil change, but overall you'll want to flush it kind of every time you change your brakes. So if you have your brakes replaced at 20,000 miles, you'll want to replace the brake fluid around that same time. Now, tires are another expensive item on cars. So different tires have different treads and they have different longevities that they expect them to last. The thicker the tread, the more miles you can get out of your tire. And so when you're looking at tire prices, tires that don't last as long, like you can get 30,000 mile tires, those are going to be cheaper than a 50,000 mile tire. And also some tires have different features. So you can get tires that are specifically made to perform well in mud and snow. Those tires are going to have thick tread, and they're also going to have varied tread, so that way when you're driving in the snow or in the mud, it's going to be able to get grip. Whereas if you're a race car, you're going to have bald tires and it's going to grip that dry road really well, but those tires aren't going to last very long if you're a race car because you're putting a lot of heavy wear on that. It's recommended that every time that you get your oil change, you actually rotate your tires. And what that means is you take the front tire and switch it with the tire on the back on the same side. And that's because most cars typically use either front wheel brakes or rear brakes. And so they do have other brakes in the car, but those are the ones that are used the most. And if you're constantly leaving the tire on the front or the back, whichever you have, using that brake, the tire that's constantly being used by the brake is going to have more wear and tear on it than the tire that's not. So if you rotate it every time that you get your oil changed, you're evening out how much each tire has wear and tear on it. In addition, you want to check your tire tread every season. As your tires get used up, the tread will go down and you can see it. And so one of the things they tell you on the driver's ed test is you take a penny, and if you can see all of Abraham Lincoln's head on that penny, then that means your tires need to be changed. And so you want to check the tire tread. Sometimes you may decide to change the tire tread even before the tire is 100% used up, because you want to make sure you have good grip. So for us, if we're going into winter and the tire's like 95% used up, I'm just going to replace my tires then, because I want to make sure I don't have any issues if we have any snow. And the other thing to think about when replacing your tires is to think about how much you drive. If you're someone who doesn't drive that many miles a year, you should get tires that don't have as many miles on them to drive, because if you're like, well, it's cheaper for me per mile to get a tire that can last 50,000 miles versus a tire that can last 30,000 miles, but I only drive my car 5,000 miles a year, well, within a few years, your tires may start to dry rot, which means that they're going to break long before they're actually going to wear out. And what can happen with that is if you have a tire that's dry rotted, is when you're driving, the whole entire side of the tire rips out. And I've had that happen before on a tire, and that's very scary. It's worse than just a flat. You basically, your car just pulls to one side and you can be in a very serious accident. So when you're replacing your tires, you want to take into consideration how long you'll have that tire, how much you're going to drive that car, and you don't want to have tires that are super old or that don't have any tread. The last item on here is tune-ups. And so a tune-up is where you're changing your spark plugs, you're replacing belts, you're replacing filters, things like that. Depending on your car and what all parts are in it, you may or may not need to do a tune-up on it sooner rather than later. For our van, we recently had it tuned up. We did it around 100,000 miles, and we replaced all of the spark plugs in the van, and we had them do a general once over and just kind of clean everything up and replace a lot of those small parts that get dirty and used up. And if those small parts end up breaking, it can cause expensive fixes. So getting your car tuned up regularly, even though that can be expensive, it's better than having to replace expensive items in a vehicle because you didn't maintain the car. Now, a few things to consider for your maintenance planning. In general, you should have tools on hand in your car at all times. This is because if something happens while you're out, you should be able to fix it. So you want to have a spare tire, you want to have a tire jack, you want wrenches and pliers and screwdrivers. That way you can replace your tire. If your car battery, let's say you left your lights on and it drained the battery, you want to have some jumper cables so you can get a jump from someone else. Headlamps go out. Have a set of replacement headlamps. And in general, you should always keep a first aid kit in your car, and you should have blankets, especially in the winter, for if your car breaks down. It's just something you want to keep on hand in your car. The other item to consider is that when you are looking at replacement items, some companies offer warranties on those items. So because my husband works on our car, he replaces the brakes himself. Well, you can get lifetime warranties on your brakes. That means that I pay a little bit more for one set of brakes, but every time I need to replace those brakes, we take the old ones back and we get a new set, and it doesn't cost me any money. And so if my car is new or newer and it's going to have multiple times that we're replacing the brakes, it makes sense to spend the extra money and get that warranty. But if the car is older and I have to replace something and I think, well, let's say the alternator goes out and the car's at 125,000 miles. I don't know if I'll have that car in 250,000 miles, so I may decide I don't need a lifetime warranty on an alternator, and I wouldn't be willing to pay the extra money. Now, if my car was 50,000 miles and something happened to my alternator, maybe I would get the lifetime warranty. It's just something to keep in mind when you're determining how much something costs or what you're willing to pay for the item you're replacing. And then kind of the last item to mention is to shop around. Everyone isn't always handy, and even though my husband can change the brakes on the car, sometimes he can't fix something because it takes some special tool, or the vehicle needs to be on a lift, or maybe it's just hard to get into that space, or maybe he just doesn't even feel like doing it, and that's okay. If you're looking for a mechanic, Ask your friends who someone is that they recommend and that they trust, and also don't be afraid to get different prices from different places, because some places charge a lot more than others. So you want to get references, but you also want to figure out prices. Now for this section of the book, the practice problems we're looking at are going to be a little bit shorter. So this first one we have, Cameron Cannon spent $1,500 on repairs and maintenance over the last year, and he drove 15,000 miles. It says, what is the cost of repairs per mile? So kind of our cue here to know what this calculation is asking us is they're saying cost of repairs, and this word per actually means divided by miles. So if the cost of repairs was $1,500, I'm going to divide that by the number of miles that I drove, and that's going to give me 10 cents a mile. So if I want to make that kind of to look like $1, it cost me 10 cents per mile in repairs. The next item or question I have here is, it says, Elliot Irwin needs to replace his front bumper. He got an estimate from 2 places. The first place told him they would charge $1,100, and the second place told him they would charge $900. What is the percentage difference between the 2 estimates? Okay, so for this one, I want to know how much more is it if I go with the more expensive item versus going with the cheaper item. So this one's going to visit another formula we already looked at, which was a rate difference. So I'm going to take this $1,100 and I'm going to subtract off the $900, because this is going to tell me the difference in price. What I'm going to divide this by is the smaller amount in this case, because I want to know how much difference in price is it based off of the smaller amount. And so this would tell me it's $200 over 900, and that's going to equal 0.22. That puts it in decimal format. I want to put it in percent format, so I'm going to multiply it by 100, and that's going to be 22.2% price difference.